Hello, my friend, and welcome back. This is actually the very final last part of the Getting Started course for ICS OT cybersecurity. So what I did think about doing was coming back and going through the review questions for the course, which a lot of people might not even know existed. So let's go ahead and I'll show you where we can actually get the review questions. If you go to my GitHub repository, so if you're on GitHub, let me flip over there. And you go to the utilsec page, so github.com/utilsec, utilsec, and you'll see there's a couple of different repositories, and have lots of different resources. I have the Getting Started books, the ebooks that are there. You can see here in Getting Started with ICS. I have the quick start guides for things like Shodan and Nmap. And then you can see in the upper right hand corner, I have ICS OT intro course resources. It's kind of ugly. It's an ugly name, but if you go in here, you can see that there's the intro to ICS OT cybersecurity review questions. So if you go ahead and open that up, I'm going to go ahead and just download it. I'm going to click on the little download button, and then I'll go ahead and open it up in Word. Okay, and so here you have the review questions. We have 10 questions for each of the parts. So we have 10 parts, so there's 100 questions. So hopefully you'll be able to use these to test your knowledge as you go along. At the very end of the document is the answer key. So if you want to go back and check your answers, you have that as an option. I was curious to put these into ChatGPT and see if it scores 100 or not, or if I'd be curious to see if it missed something and what it missed. But anyways, so let's jump into the questions and answers. So you see unit one, so going back all the way to the very beginning, we talked at a high level about ICS OT cybersecurity. A big part of it is why we need cybersecurity in ICS OT. We talk about protecting especially critical infrastructure and the different services that we come to rely on in our daily lives: energy, water, right? Manufacturing, and we get to the list just starts to go on and on and anyways, let's go ahead and look at the question. So question number one: which of the following is of the least concern in industrial control environments? So we had physical safety, environmental safety, data confidentiality, and site availability. So when we talk about the least concern, this is where we get into the idea that IT and OT are very similar at times, and they're also very different, because in the IT world, that our main concern is always the availability of resources, and more importantly, when we talk about the confidentiality of data, making sure that our information stays safe from attackers. It's almost the exact opposite in the OT world, where we look at, most importantly, physical safety, right? Making sure people stay safe and they go home at the end of the day. We think of environmental safety. We want to make sure that the environment where that plant is located is safe. And if I had a petrochemical facility and if there was an explosion there, how would it impact the surrounding environment? And then a lot of people will sometimes think, well, the main priority in OT is uptime, right? Making sure the plant is up and running and producing whatever it's supposed to produce. Again, that's definitely one of our priorities, but it's number 3 on the list. So it's always physical safety first, environmental safety, and then uptime or site availability. Data confidentiality. Remember, that's the primary goal for IT cybersecurity, but not for OT cybersecurity. So question 2, discovered in 2010, which of the following ICS OT specific malware attacks targeted the Natanz facility in Iran and has been described as crossing the Rubicon, which came, when I had read it, it was part of an interview that Andy Greenberg had included in his book, Sandworm. Remember, Sandworm is the nation state attacker from Russia, or attack group, I should say, from Russia, that, amongst other things, was targeting um, uh, the Ukrainian power grid in 2015 and 2016 and potentially in 2017 and 2022. But we also look at the idea of not only in this case, you want to talk about Sandworm being the Russian nation state, but Stuxnet was created by the United States and Israel to target the nuclear facility in Iran, where they were enriching uranium gas to ideally make a nuclear bomb. So that was when the United States and Israel created Stuxnet to be able to go into the environment as a cyber weapon rather than dropping physical bombs and potentially, killing innocent civilians. So create a cyber weapon to be able to destroy the different centrifuges that they were using at the facility rather than killing people. And I'm sure there's other interesting parts to those conversations behind closed doors we'll never understand. But Stuxnet was this piece of malware that was created. And when we talk about crossing the Rubicon, that is, it's really the first known piece of malware that was designed to target ICS OT. Maybe there were some others before that we don't know about. But also, it was where we have one nation state attacking another nation state with a cyber weapon. And kind of opened up Pandora's box. And at the same time, there really were no repercussions. So if I'm Russia or China and I see the United States and Israel attacking Iran and nothing happened, it's, well, we can do this too. And I think personally, also at the same time, Russia and China and other countries around the world realized, looking at how this technical marvel of Stuxnet, which still today is a really, really say technical marvel. But that's how I always describe it, even today. But the idea is that, other countries, saw this and realized they really needed to step up their game, especially when it comes to ICS OT. So not only was it, hey, we need to step up our game, but it was also, there's no repercussions for attacking other countries. And so this was really, again, opening Pandora's box, or really the start of where we crossed that line, and there was no going back. That's the idea of crossing the Rubicon. So number 2 is Stuxnet. So question 3, let's go ahead and scroll on down. Which of the following was developed as an attack framework for targeting common ICS OT assets from common vendors like Schneider and Omron, and industrial protocols like Modbus, OPC UA, and Codesys? And this is one that gets highlighted very frequently, especially by Rob Lee over at Dragos and in the Dragos Year in Review report. So hopefully everybody is reading that, because that should be mandatory reading if you're in ICS OT cybersecurity. When we talk about that attack framework, I like to think of it kind of as Metasploit for ICS or OT. And it's the idea that, and I haven't seen it, it's closely guarded. I think there's probably, not too many people in the world that have actually seen it, but where Pipedream is that framework, where it's really designed to use living off the land techniques, or basically, the default capabilities of different systems in ICS OT environments against them, right? It's not, using exploits for, vulnerabilities in code. Maybe there's some of that in there. I haven't seen Pipedream, but the main focus of it is just using the default capabilities of these systems. So maybe it finds like a Schneider Electric, or I'm thinking maybe like a Siemens PLC. Like a Siemens PLC automatically runs things like even something as simple as SNMP, and it's a service that you can connect to and use it to enumerate different parts of the system. So it can connect and it can gather that information automatically for you. That would be a very simple example of where it's using those default capabilities, especially if you haven't even assigned a password to the PLC in general. So Pipedream is that framework. If you're more interested in learning more about Pipedream, the Dragos team has done a couple of demonstrations over the last couple of years, especially like at DEF CON, where you can find those videos on YouTube that actually show. I think the last one I saw was where they demonstrated using Pipedream. Again, you don't really see the code or the framework itself or the tool, but using it to attack. Basically, I think they were simulating basically like a water treatment facility, and where they could essentially almost like melt down a water heater, I guess is pretty much what it was at the end of the day. So that is Pipedream for number 3. So question 4, which party is ultimately responsible for the cybersecurity of a facility? This is one where, depending on who you ask, you might get different answers, but ultimately it's the asset owner. So we talked about there's this idea of asset owners and asset operators, which is kind of a weird, it could be weird terms if you're new to ICS OT, but if you just take off the asset part, I think it's easier where it's it's the owners. It's the people or the company that owns that facility. My first ICS project was a power plant for Dominion Energy. So Dominion Energy was, they were the owners. They were the asset owner. And then you can have a different company or the same company also operate or run the facility, right? So that's the operators or the asset operator. So in that case, I believe it was also Dominion Energy that was the operator. They were the asset owner and the asset operator, but they could also pay somebody else to do that. So ultimately, though, it's the owner's responsibility to ensure cybersecurity, to make sure they have things like budget, to be able to hire people, to be able to plan and implement cybersecurity, even though we know that so many of the ICS OT environments out there are so small that they don't have those resources. Like especially we always use examples of water and wastewater. They don't have the resources. They don't have a person that they could dedicate to cybersecurity in OT, let alone cybersecurity in general. They might not even have a person for IT. They're that small. They just don't have those resources. Yeah, so question 4, it's the asset owners that are responsible ultimately for cybersecurity. So question 5. In 2015, which nation-state adversary group was responsible for the Ukrainian blackout? I actually mentioned this earlier when we were talking about the Russians targeting the Ukraine, and that's Sandworm. So remember, if you haven't read Andy Greenberg's book yet, for me, it's the best book you can read if you're interested in ICS OT cybersecurity, because you get this background in history, and while it's not 100% dedicated to ICS OT, it really does set that stage and provide this kind of global view and why we need people in ICS OT cybersecurity. So number 5 is B, Sandworm. Question 6, which of the following is not considered a critical infrastructure sector according to CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency? And as I'm recording this just a few days ago, they were hacked via one of their Avanti VPN appliances, which they were warning the entire world about. So that was very interesting. But when we look at the different sectors. Remember, there were 16 different sectors, or I used to think of them as like different types of environments, or sometimes people might say even different types of businesses. In this case, communications, dams, nuclear reactors, materials and waste are all critical infrastructure sectors designated by the United States government to say, yeah, these are different sectors or services, right, that the world depends on for our daily lives. Now, data centers house, of course, the all the systems that we've come to rely on. So we think of all the web-based applications that are hosted in the cloud and that live in data centers and Netflix and the list can go on and everything we use in our daily lives. Those do actually fall under a critical infrastructure sector for information technology, but not called out as data centers. So that was, I guess, a little bit of a trick question. So data centers is not a specifically named sector on the critical infrastructure sector list. Sorry if I got you on that one. Question 7. Which critical infrastructure sector refers to those organizations which act as contractors and subcontractors in helping the United States government accomplish its goals and mission? For me, I think this is one of the more fascinating ones, and maybe I'm a little biased because at my day job at Fluor, about 10-15% of the company is dedicated to supporting the United States government, and we do a lot of intel and military work. But that's the Defense Industrial Base, which I have basis there. So it's B. I need to go back and update that. So it's the Defense Industrial Base. That's for government contractors. Again, this is the list for the United States. You would have an equivalent, in other countries. They might or might not show up on a critical sector list, though, a critical infrastructure sector list. Question 8, which of the following is the most overlooked aspect of cybersecurity in both ICS, OT, and IT networks? I think we touched on this in that unit briefly when we talk about physical security. And we talked about things like data confidentiality. That's a priority for IT cybersecurity. Not so much in OT, unless you have some top secret formula you're worried about. Then it's important, but I think the majority of OT environments aren't concerned with data confidentiality typically. And sure, we're always worried about phishing attacks for employees that receive emails. And I always, try to highlight PLC vulnerabilities, even though not many people even think PLCs are vulnerable, even though they're very vulnerable at times. But yeah, the most overlooked security in ICS, OT, or IT is physical security. Because remember, if you can get into an environment, if you can get into a facility, if you can touch an asset like a PLC or a Windows workstation or server, or maybe it's a wireless access point or a printer, or just walking into that conference room in that stereotypical scenario of unplugging an asset that was has an Ethernet cable and plugging in, and you get an IP address through DHCP, and then you can use that connectivity to attack the rest of the environment. Or if you can touch something, you can own it, typically. Or at least factory reset it and then have a denial of service attack at the end of the day at a bare minimum. So yeah, physical security is most overlooked. A lot of cybersecurity teams, I would say the vast majority of cybersecurity professionals, do not see physical security, A, as their responsibility, or B, something that's important, and yet it's so fundamental to cybersecurity for all of us. Question 9, what is the least important aspect of cybersecurity in traditional IT networks? And so this is part of that conversation I threw in there. So it's kind of going back and comparing and contrasting ICS, OT to IT. I remember in the IT world, we talk about the big 3 requirements: confidentiality, integrity, and availability, or the CIA triad, just as they're listed there. The one that we're, ultimately that's the least important is compliance. And the same thing is in the ICS OT world, right? We might work in, let's say in the United States or Canada in a power plant, and we have to be NERC CIP compliant. which is great. And we want to make sure, yes, we're compliant with the laws, and we want to make sure, of course, we don't get any fines, but it also helps us keep the plant safer. But remember, our ultimate goals in cybersecurity and ICS/OT are always making sure people stay safe, the environment stays safe, and the environment stays up and running. Can we do that? Does compliance help? Yes, by applying those different controls. But also just keep in mind compliance. It's even if we're fully NERC compliant, it doesn't mean we can't be compromised. Right? It just means we've taken really, good steps in protecting the environment. But no environment is 100% secure. And NERC is just an example. Again, it's a good place to start. Question 10, scroll down a little bit. So in 2021, Colonial Pipeline had to take the United States' largest oil pipeline offline for approximately a week or 10 days due to an attack launched by and this is where we saw, and we spent some time talking about Colonial Pipeline and really highlighted it throughout the course because it was really a big turning point in ICS/OT. And so this is fairly recent history, 3 years ago at this point. Where prior to that, it was always nation-state adversaries that were attacking ICS/OT environments that we knew of, right? So we had Russia, China, the United States, and other countries. Where in this case, it wasn't a nation-state. It was a ransomware group. It was a ransomware group. Yes, they were from Russia, but they weren't necessarily taking direction from the Russian government. They weren't working directly from them. They weren't in the Russian military. And that they were just sending phishing emails to everyone in the world probably that they had email addresses for, and just waiting for people to click on links or open up attachments that they shouldn't to infect their system. And then that infection would spread to other systems. And that resulted in Colonial Pipeline having to shut down the pipeline for, more like 10 days. And not only did they have to shut down, but again, it was the largest oil pipeline in the United States, or actually, in this case, it was being used for gasoline. And so you actually saw that if on the East Coast, where I live, you would go to the gas station and there was no gas. Now you could go around the corner in another gas station, they had gas. It was just a really long line. So it wasn't like we were completely out of gas. But there definitely were real world impacts that we saw. So anyways, with that, I knew. So the largest pipeline in the United States was taken offline by a ransomware group. All right, and that's what we covered in Unit 1, kind of that high level intro of why we're here and different types of attackers and a bit of the history of ICS/OT. All right, so let's jump in. I'll probably maybe go a little bit quicker. So let's look at question 1. So which of the following would be considered a field device? So with the field device, that was, go back in your mind looking at the Purdue model. So at the very lowest part of the Purdue model, that's where we had the field devices. I always think of, for me, the most common type of field device, or it's that first level 0 device that we ever interact with, is a sensor. And a sensor, like in our example of the PLC, but think of the thermostat as the PLC, right? It has that sensor that's taking the temperature continually of the air around us in the room. So it's bringing in that temperature and then using that to make decisions on whether it needs to turn on the heater or turn on the air conditioner. But sensors are considered a field device, or what operates at level 0. We have PLCs that sensors feed that information to, and we'll talk about them more as we go throughout these questions. We have data historians. Remember, data historians are typically Windows servers running something like Microsoft SQL Server or maybe Oracle database applications to store data about how the environment is operating. And then Modbus is an actual protocol that we use for communicating between control systems. So again, in this case, we're talking about the field device. In this case, is the sensor or seat. Okay, so question number 2, which of the following industrial control assets is used to program a PLC? This is where we talked about the engineering workstation, is where I'll say a technician would sit to connect to a PLC over either maybe doing that over TCP/IP remotely, or you might be sitting there physically, next to the PLC and connect to it with a local cable like a RS-232 serial connection. So that's the engineering workstation. Remember, the HMI is where we have a picture, right, of the actual process of the systems, and you'll be able to get information and alerts, and it'll have buttons that we can press to turn things on or turn things off or make things go faster or slower, right, to make changes to the processes. Right, the SIS is that fail-safe backup in case we need to shut down the facility safely. And then we already talked about the data historian, which stores information about how the process has been working over time. But the engineering workstation is what we would use to come in and program a PLC or may upload a new version of the firmware. Question 3, to secure a PLC using its key switch, which of the following is true? This is actually part of kind of where my master's thesis went down a slight rabbit hole. But the idea is that the community in general, right, believes that, and rightfully so for most, for many, we should say models, is that if you place the PLC in run mode, then it essentially places the PLC in what we might think of as quote-unquote read-only mode. So that way an attacker can't remotely change the PLC programming like the ladder logic. And they wouldn't be able to upload new firmware. And so it's kind of this general, assumption within the community. If your PLCs are in run mode, it can't be hacked. Now that's not always true. In fact, most of the time it's not actually true, which is again where my thesis came in, just to highlight that. So, but out of all of these, if a PLC is in run mode, it typically means you at least cannot upload firmware. So it does keep, or it does protect the PLC from having its firmware essentially hijacked, right, or backdoored. But it might not protect against somebody remotely updating the running code. So just keep that in mind. So question number 4, which of the following control systems typically runs commodity operating systems like Windows and Linux, and commodity software, Microsoft SQL Server and Oracle, making it a prime target for attackers? So when we talk about commodity, just think anything in IT. Right? So we have all these systems that we've always used in IT for decades, and we've seen them slowly creep into ICS OT. And this is where if I was breaking into an environment, especially since these systems also sit in the IT OT DMZ, the data historian is a primary target. Because if you're not, or maybe you are patching Windows, the operating system, on that server, but maybe you're not patching Microsoft SQL Server. And it also has its own vulnerabilities that you could use to remotely take control over that system. I've done it before as a pen tester, and it's not that hard even today. So yeah, data historians are those servers running typically Windows Server, running Microsoft SQL, maybe Oracle, storing all that data that we've collected about how the environment or the plant performs over time. But at the end of the day, it's a prime target for attackers because, again, they're typically some of the easier machines to break into, and then they use that initial foothold to spread to other systems, especially because you more than likely have a data historian located in the IT/OT DMZ. All right, so question 5, let me scroll down. Which of the following is the most common language used to program PLCs? I think this is still if you talk with most people, this is still ladder logic. Okay, so quick glitch. But anyways, question 5, which of the following is the most common language used to program PLCs? So I guess as I was starting to mention, I think that the most talk about popular or commonly used protocol or language, sorry, in programming PLCs is still ladder logic, and that's the one that I'm familiar with. There are other ones out there that are up and coming that seem almost even more popular among like PLC programmers in different circles. So when you talk about the ones I hear the most about are things like structured text and function block diagram or FBD. So those are the ones, and there's a few others out there as well, but the one structured text is the one that I probably hear about the most, and then function block diagram. So I think there's two or three others out there, but again, nothing that I'm too familiar with. Question 6, which of the following control systems is used to coordinate the operations of multiple systems at a single location? Remember, it's the distributed control system, or DCS, or we can have PLCs that can handle individual processes on a one-on-one basis. But, and I always maybe kind of take a step back and we think of our thermostat example. So what if I want to, I have that one thermostat that controls the temperature in a single room, but what if that's within an office building? And we have thermostats throughout the entire building. We could coordinate those with a single system. I guess that's an example we can use for now. I'm still working on that one, I guess. Still, but that would be the idea of a DCS, where everything, right, we can control multiple controllers from a single entity. All right, so let's drop down to question 7. Which of the following control systems is a graphical interface used to monitor and make changes to a PLC's operation? That's the HMI that we were mentioning earlier, right? We have a screen that we can usually touch screen we can interact with. We can actually see some type of graphical representation of the process. And so maybe you can see things like conveyor belts, and you can see options to maybe stop if you needed to, or even start those conveyor belts and the process for what's being created and dropped onto those conveyor belts and moved on down to the next stop. So that is the HMI. Question 8, which of the following control systems acts as a fail-safe backup, which can be used to safely shut down the facility in the event of a plant fault or emergency situation? Remember, that's the SIS, or the safety instrumented system. And we highlighted that when we talked about the Triconics, or the Trisis, or the Trident event. It was Triconics SIS controllers that were targeted in the Trisis event, or where the attackers had come in and compromised the SIS, which is that fail-safe backup. So if we ever detect a fault in the environment, it's going to safely shut down either part of the facility or the entire facility to ensure that everybody stays safe, the environment stays safe, and the plant stays intact as well. So question number 9, due to its use of commodity operating systems and software that are popular in IT environments, which of the following is a primary target for attackers? And this is what we were already talking about earlier, was the data historian, right? It's that one asset, all these, right? We could talk about PLCs. I don't know what PLC server was kind of like a bad answer thrown in there. So hopefully you picked up on that. The DCS, right? That's not a traditional IT system. We were just talking about that. SCADA, right? It's not a traditional IT, but remember, data historians, they run Windows. It's a Windows server. You're probably running Microsoft SQL Server the vast majority of the time, and it's going to be a very popular target for attackers. And again, as we mentioned earlier, it's probably also sitting in your IT OT DMZ. So it could be very exposed to the IT if those firewall rules aren't set up correctly. So yes, so question number 9 is C, data historian. And then question number 10, which of the following is not considered an industrial control protocol? So this is another one where I threw in kind of hopefully hopefully this jumps out because, or if anything, we're looking at, if you come from the IT world, NetBIOS could stand out as that Windows protocol, right? That's very chatty, and Windows systems love to talk to each other and share just tons of information about each other. And there's lots of different aspects to NetBIOS as well from a security perspective. But yeah, NetBIOS is an IT protocol, if you want to label it as such. When we talk about, even though we see it, of course, in OT environments when there's Windows systems, but we talk about traditional industrial control protocols, right? These are the ones that wouldn't run necessarily over TCP/IP, right? But can be on a self-contained network. So now there's versions of these that run over TCP/IP, and that's usually what we see now. But S7, or S7COM, as you see it listed a lot, that's the Siemens protocol. Modbus, which is the most commonly used industrial control protocol, in open source, Modbus is out there. We spent some time, and we'll talk about that more in the next unit. And then BACnet, which is for building automation and control, which is where the BAC comes from, at least for me. All right, so that's unit 2. So let's go ahead and jump down to unit 3. So in unit 3, this is where we've talked about why we need cybersecurity in control system environments. We've talked about the different types, the basics of control systems, the different types of systems and some protocols. And we covered all those in those first 2 units. So in unit 3, this is where we actually start talking about how do we secure our ICS OT environments. And so for me, the number one place we want to start is with secure network architecture. So question 1, which level of the Purdue model does a PLC reside on? Maybe as we go through this section, it probably makes sense for me to pull up the Purdue model just so you can see it. So just one sec. So I pulled up the Purdue model, and we can look at the different layered approach and talking about how IT systems talk within IT. But really, it's about how OT is structured and how systems within the OT environment work, and how IT and OT interact. And so we go back and I kind of took out the internet so we can focus a little bit more on just the main IT and OT network, so you can see it a little bit better. So we'll go back and look at the question. And so which of the Purdue model, which level of the Purdue model does a PLC typically reside on? So remember, earlier in the last unit, we talked about sensors being at that the most lower level 0. And that the sensors feed information to PLCs. So if our sensors are at level 0, then we would imagine that our PLCs are at level 1. So we'll typically see PLCs at level 1. There you can see on the Purdue model. So the answer for question 1 there is B. So question 2, the IT, OT, DMZ resides between which 2 levels of the Purdue model? So remember, when we look at that DMZ we create between the IT network and the OT network, we talk about, and you can see it here, right? We talk about level 3.5 because it sits between 3 and 4. Right, so remember, 4 and 5 are IT, 3 and below are OT. So if we're going to stick a DMZ in between the 2, that's what we call level 3.5. I know it was not in the original Purdue model. It's what we call the expanded model. But yes, we call it level 3.5, or yes, it's C between levels 3 and 4. So question 3, which of the following network-based appliances should be used to create the IT OT DMZ? So one where we talked about previously in the unit, we want to use firewalls. I've gone into environments that use switches or other other types of appliances, but we want to use dedicated hardware firewalls really to do this the most securely. And so much better if you can even make them from different vendors, just in case an attacker has an exploit to bypass one. But yes, that does introduce additional administrative overhead, but it's going to be the most secure. All right, let me scroll these up a little bit. So question 4, which of the following levels of the Purdue model would an HMI typically be hosted on? So if we kind of go back to our earlier example where we were starting with sensors at level 0, remember that feed data into a PLC. And so then that PLC sits at level 1, and then that, of course, that PLC is controlled by an HMI. So we're typically going to see those HMIs up one level at level 2. So you can see it there. So remember, sensors feed data to the PLC, and then the PLC is controlled by the HMI. So level 0 to level 1, the HMI sitting at level 2. So B. Question 5, which of the following levels of the Purdue model should be the only level that is connected directly to the internet? And we can go back to our earlier, you can see layer 6, which doesn't exist, or you might say that is the internet, but in this case you can see level 5 is the one that's going to be connected directly to the internet, even though realistically probably 4 and 5 in IT are, but we'll just say based off of the Purdue model, right, we should only go from level 5 assets to the internet. So B as in boy. Question number 6, which of the following ICS-specific malware attacks compromised the safety instrumented system of a petrochemical facility in the Middle East to target human life? I guess I should move this up. And we talked about it earlier, that was Trisis, where the Russian nation state had come in and had access to the entire environment, including the DCS and the SIS, which was not segmented off. It didn't have its key switches in run mode, and there was a long laundry list of lessons. I think the great thing that, and you can see about today, is that I think Saudi Aramco, being one of the world's largest organizations, has dramatically improved their security in ICS OT since then. And I think that was a big lesson learned. I think that was a huge turning point for them. And they have probably one of, if not the world's best ICS OT cybersecurity programs. So, question 7, according to ISA 6243 or ISA 62443, the ICS OT network should further be broken down into which logical grouping of systems. And that's where we talked about zones are the way where we can take different OT assets, or should say assets within the OT network, and then break them down or group them based off of the function that they serve. So those assets are, especially those assets are communicating with each other often. More than likely, they're going to be within the same zone. A lot of times you'll see that does happen just to map out to different VLANs because of the way it was set up. Not always, but it could. So there's technical differences, but yeah. Those are zones according to ISA 62443. Let me scroll down a little bit more. So question number 8, the term IIoT refers to which of the following? So remember, IIoT stands for Industrial Internet of Things, which we talked about in the course can be a couple of different things, I think, to different people. But at a high level, the idea is anytime we take the OT network or an asset on the OT network and connect it to the internet, then that essentially becomes IIoT, whether we realize it or not. Now, the general example that we talked about in the most popular use case is where we're sending that data to the cloud, to data centers with computers that can bring in vast amounts of data, and it has the computational and the memory power to be able to crunch the numbers to do things like predictive analytics. So in this case, Question number 8, allowing ICS OT assets to send data directly to the internet for analysis. So D, just remember we want to be able to send it in that one-way fashion and not allow return traffic that could potentially allow an attacker to enter the environment. So question 9, which of the following is typically not a consideration for cybersecurity teams? That was one we had mentioned, I think actually in the last unit, right? Most understand, we talk about, of course, this entire section was around secure network architecture. We are going to talk more about network security monitoring, secure remote access, but most people in cybersecurity, whether it's ICS, OT, or IT, don't really see physical security as their job or as important to what they do, even though, again, everything we do is based off of physical security. So it's extremely important. So question 9 is, the answer is B, as in boy. And then question 10, to wrap out this unit, which of the following social engineering attacks can be used to obtain sensitive information that has been printed out? So typically we talk about people printing out sensitive information. They can leave it out on their desk. They could throw it away in a trash can or put it in a recycle bin rather than putting it in a secure shred-it bin. And so this is where we talk about eventually if it ends up in the dumpster or if somebody gains access to maybe the office where that information is located, maybe the office building on site, then that's what we call dumpster diving. So we're pulling information literally out of a dumpster or a trash can or a recycle bin. So, and I've done all of those over the years. So, all right, so that's unit 3. So let's jump into unit 4. So unit 4, we started talking about another security control that we use to help secure our OT environments. As the asset registers. And remember, the asset registers provide not only an understanding of what's in the environment and what we're protecting, but it also is a firm foundation for those other controls we're going to come back and talk about, like vulnerability management and incident detection and response. So it's extremely critical that we have a solid asset register and as complete as possible. So question 1, an asset register should include all of the following except, we mentioned in the course that the main 3 focuses of the asset register are a list of all the hardware assets we have, as well as any of the software and the firmware running on those assets. So that way, especially that can help us identify vulnerabilities in systems. So the one thing we're not going to want to track, which hopefully this was a dead giveaway, but personnel records. So personnel records, or D, is the one thing we're not going to want in an asset register. We're just tracking information related to the hardware, software, and firmware, like the version and type of those assets in the environment. So question number 2, which of the following is not considered a method for building a complete ICS OT asset register? So we talked about 4 main ways that we could build a asset register. And one would be physically walking the environment. We can review packet captures from the network using a tool like Wireshark. We can review existing data in files that we would have, whether it's engineering diagrams, maybe it's project files, maybe it's PLC program. Maybe you have some hints there, or at least information about a particular PLC. Any project management files for that facility definitely should have information. Procurement records, so as we're buying assets and bringing them into the environment, right, we should be able to use that information to build an asset register. Can we actively scan levels 3 and 4 or 4 and 5 of the Purdue model? Yes, we can. Just remember levels 4 and 5 of the Purdue model, that's the IT network. So that's not going to help us build an ICS OT asset register. So yeah, the answer for question 2 is C, which is not a method we would use. Question 3, which of the following could potentially create availability issues within the ICS OT network? This is the one where you talk about while this is not as much a case in current and greenfield environments today, we still are usually abundantly and overly cautious. So we never want to perform active scanning of ICS or OT networks with Nmap, right, the network scanner. So B. Question 4, which is considered the most dangerous method of building an asset register? That's the one where we talked about physically walking the environment. Could be very dangerous. Been in some environments like a power plant where, especially even though part of it was still under construction, but even if it's not, right, just the amount of risk to your physical safety in that type of environment, it does exist. And so if you're going through different environments in the industrial world, right, trying to trace cables to find that one PLC, right, or going down to the field device or maybe sensor level, right, trying to track those types of assets down can, again, depending on the environment, could be very dangerous. I can probably imagine, more than a few. So yeah, so the answer is A. Scroll down. Question 5, which of the following properties would normally not be included in an asset register? In this case, we would include the asset name, the serial number, the last maintenance date, among many other things. Usually you can have 10, 15, 20 different properties. From an asset register perspective, I'm not necessarily worried about who approved the invoice to purchase that asset. That should be in other records, but wouldn't necessarily be included in the asset register. It's not important to or it's not relevant, right, to what we're trying to use the asset register for and identifying what we have in the environment to protect. So question 5 is C. Question number 6, when should an asset register be considered 100% complete and accurate? So this is one of those that, for me, I always like to think, and I've seen this over time, even if your asset register is 100% complete today, right, there doesn't mean that it's going to be complete tomorrow. Somebody somewhere is going to make a change. Hopefully it's a technician doing it in an authorized change window with permission and not an attacker, but it could be an attacker potentially implanting something physically on the network. But the whole point is the network's going to change. Now, it doesn't change as often in ICS and OT as it does in IT, for sure. So, which makes it, in some ways, much easier to defend. But again, I'm never going to assume it's 100% complete. We're always going to strive for 100% completeness, but never assume it's 100% complete. So question 6, the answer is D, as in dog. All right. So question number 7, which of the following is the most common way to store asset registers? Yes, we still use Excel everywhere in the world today to store records about the hardware, software, and firmware versions and all the different properties for those that we have in the environment. So the question is, A, Microsoft Excel. Question number 8, which of the following should be completed while building an asset register while walking the site? This kind of goes back to what we were mentioning earlier, and when I was talking a little bit about my master's thesis, is if you are walking the site, which again could be dangerous, very dangerous, depending on the environment, that as you come across different PLCs, you do want to check if those PLCs have key switches, physical key switches, where you would insert the key and then turn it to determine what operational mode that the PLC is in, that you always want to make sure it's in run mode. Remember, run mode, it's not a silver bullet. Doesn't mean necessarily that PLC is 100% protected from being remotely manipulated. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't, right? Depending on the models. You have to be very, very familiar with the models of PLCs. But again, that in general, it seems that at least if a PLC is in run mode, it will protect the PLC from having malicious or unauthorized firmware uploads made. It might not prevent somebody from remotely changing the PLC programming, but again, it will more than likely prevent firmware from being uploaded. But again, just make sure you double check, read the documentation, maybe even if you have a PLC test, because when I was doing my master's research, the documentation can be a little spotty and not include all the details. So definitely test this out for each different type of model of PLC you have. And in some of the larger environments I've worked in, that would be a full-time job for someone for years. But that's unfortunately what it takes today to make that happen. But anyways, question 8, yeah, the answer would be A, check the key switch position for each PLC to make sure it's in run mode. All right. So question 9, which of the following commands can be used to display the ARP cache on a Windows system? So we can bring up CMD, and then if you type in ARP, right, you just get the, here's the help file, and then if we're looking at the help file, it tells us the first option is -A. And then you can see I have multiple entries because I have multiple network interfaces in the machine because of VMware. But you can see all the different IP addresses that my system has been talking with, and not only the IP addresses, but because it's the ARP cache, remember ARP's used to resolve IP addresses to MAC addresses, we see those IP addresses and the associated MAC addresses. So that is how we see the ARP cache with ARP-A on Windows machines, which is a great way in ICS OT environments. Log into those Windows machines, ARP-A, and you can get at least IP addresses and MAC addresses for other systems out there that you might not have known about. So that helps you build the asset register. So answer C for question 9. And then question 10, which of the following tools could be used for active discovery of ICS OT network hosts? That's what we were mentioning earlier, even though it's not necessarily always recommended, especially at those lower levels of the Purdue model. But in a lot of environments today, we could look at using Nmap as a network scanner to actively scan those higher levels, right? If we just jump back to the Purdue model real quick, right? This idea that when I look at level 3.5, level 3, level 2 even, the vast majority of those assets at those levels, they're all Windows machines. And then your Windows machines should be able to take an Nmap scan. And if they can't, then that's an issue you want to identify and be able to address anyways. But yes, so Nmap is the tool that we can use to do active discovery, even though a lot of environments will not do active scanning at all. So, all right, so that brings us to Unit 5. So in Unit 5, we talked about threat and vulnerability management, one of my favorite sections. And remember, threat and vulnerability management, especially vulnerability management, works very differently in OT than IT. It's one of those areas where they are vastly different. So let's jump in. So question 1, which of the following is the most important to successful vulnerability management in ICS OT environments? And this is what we were just talking about in the last unit, asset registers. Remember, asset registers provide the list of hardware, software, and firmware that we have in the environment, including the vendors, the type, and the version number. So we can use that to look up, are there any vulnerabilities in these known versions of these known pieces of software or hardware or firmware in the environment? So if that's the bare minimum we do from a vulnerability management perspective, we still have that ability. We don't have to take other tactics or approaches if we want to vulnerability management, even though we do. But as a bare minimum, you could do that if you had to. So question 2, to calculate risk, the threat is multiplied with 3 other factors. Which of the following is not one of these factors? So I talked about, and when I pulled up the slide, right? The idea is that when we calculate risk, this is where we multiply the threat times the vulnerability times the probability times the impact, which is making me think I needed to put a wrong answer in here, and I don't think I did. Oh, yes, there is one. So B. Sorry, let me jump back here. So we had the risk is equal to the threat. Remember, the threat is what's coming after us, right? In most of our cases, we're thinking about the attackers, right? And we could talk about nation states. We can talk about ransomware group operators. Sometimes we might be talking about a hurricane, right? A typhoon or an earthquake. That, what's the threat to the environment, right? We have to have a vulnerability that the threat can take advantage of, right? And they'll exploit that vulnerability, but exploitation is not part of the equation, right? The vulnerability has to be exploited. And then if the vulnerability is exploited, we talk about what's the impact, right? What's the worst that can happen to the environment, but also what would normally happen in the environment. So we want to look at the worst case scenario as well as what's going to happen in general. And then we can also talk about what's the probability of that happening. So whether it's a probability of a nation state attacker coming in and compromising, let's say, the SIS, like in the Trisis incident, or what's the probability of a typhoon coming right over the location where the plant is located, right? What's the probability that an employee on the IT network clicks on a phishing link and infects their system with ransomware, and that ransomware moves into the OT environment? Or maybe it doesn't move into the OT environment, but it takes out all the IT systems, which still has an impact on the OT network operations. Right? That's when we talk about calculating overall risk. So out of all of those, I did do the right thing and included a fake answer. So exploitation would not be part of that equation. So B. So question number 3, in the vulnerability management lifecycle for IT, what happens after the remediate phase? So once we fix the known vulnerabilities that we're going to take the time to address, then we're going to go back and verify that the work actually fixed the issue. So a lot of times in a lot of environments, someone, and they honestly think they've fixed an issue, but they haven't. And so you want to make sure that you go back and verify. You rescan, or if it's some type of manual check that you're logging in, maybe checking a registry entry, or maybe you log into a Windows machine and pull up the history list of patches just to make sure that the work actually was done. Question number 4, a recently announced vulnerability has a CVSS score of 8.8. What risk classification would this vulnerability be assigned? As crazy as it might sound, I have these conversations at least once a week. So it's good just to kind of keep in the back of your mind that scoring system. A CVSS score of 8.8 would fall under the high risk group. Or critical, the worst of the worst vulnerabilities, that's anything with 9 to 10, right? So in that kind of that high end, that's where we look at critical, and then we go down to high, and then bump down from there. So it's typically those criticals and highs we're always keeping an eye out. But 8.8 would be a high risk vulnerability for B as in boy. All right. So let's scroll down. So question 5, traditional vulnerability scanners by default search for vulnerabilities associated with all of the following except which? And this is where we talked a little bit, and this is kind of where we put on our IT thinking caps. If you come from an IT cybersecurity background, and if you don't, then it's good to keep in mind how vulnerability scanners work by default. The idea is that they're configured to find vulnerabilities in the operating system, like Windows and Linux, but definitely more particular in Windows, and check for things like missing patches, right? Or maybe there are some security configuration changes we can make, like in the Windows registry. We can look to see what's installed on top of the operating system and see if there's any vulnerabilities in any of those pieces of software. A lot of those pieces of software expose themselves as services on the system, so you can remotely connect to them, like let's say a web server. But where those vulnerability scanners fall short is that, at least by default, they typically won't do, or if they do a scan of a web application, a web app or website that's exposed, it's very minimal. So the idea is they always usually will have add-ons or plugins that you can pay for to do more dedicated types of, or more in-depth types of web applications. So by default, we're only checking with a basic or a normal IT vulnerability scanner if you want, the operating system for vulnerabilities, the installed applications and software, and then any remotely exposed services on those hosts. If there is a website or a web application, then it will probably perform some real minimal checks, but they are typically minimal at best. So yeah, question 5, traditional vulnerability scanners do not really effectively touch web applications. You need to get a dedicated web app vulnerability scanner like Burp Suite to do that for you. All right, so question 6, which of the following vulnerabilities would more than likely be the last to be remediated? So when we look at least to be remediated, I'm thinking going back to let's jump back to the Purdue model, which I don't have open. Let me open that real quick. We'll pull up this one. The idea is, if we're looking at the Purdue model, right? If we're patching, I think in IT we're just patching. It seems like all the time, right? And that works for IT, but in OT it's very different. Now, when we get into the OT environment, think of like level 3.5, level 3, especially where we see mostly Windows machines. Those we want to keep up on those, just like in IT. And we usually have the option to be able to patch those regularly, which is nice, because we can patch, we can reboot. It doesn't impact the operations of the environment. Right? So those we're also going to be updating fairly frequently, not as frequently as IT, but fairly frequently, close enough. And the idea is, if you start following that pattern as we go down the Purdue model, that's where we can see the further we go down, the less frequent we're actually making any updates or changes to assets. So by the time you get to level 0, when you're talking about different field devices that make those changes in the real world, or and like sensors that collect data to feed a PLC, we're not almost ever going to be making updates to those. So you have IT on one end where you're updating at least probably once a month, if not more frequently. And then at the very end, you have field devices and things like sensors, which probably never get updated, and then everything in between. So you can kind of just move down that scale. So when we talk about which of the following vulnerabilities more than likely would be the last to be remediated, so what would be at the lowest level of the Purdue model? That's going to be a pressure sensor at level 0. You can see Windows system exposed directly to the internet. Oh, that's getting updated, as soon as there's a patch that comes out, right? A data historian in the ITO DMZ. Oh, there's still exposure there. So we do want to make sure that it's getting updated, whether it's running Windows or Linux. I still want to get it updated. And then that engineering workstation that we're going to use to go and program PLCs, all right? That's, again, it's another Windows asset. We can update that without impacting operations. Then we're going to update it on a regular basis. So again, as further you go down the Purdue model, so B, pressure sensor at level 0. Question 7, which of the following levels of the Purdue model is typically considered not suitable for active scanning? This is what we were mentioning earlier. Good thing I brought that diagram back up. Or just like we're kind of talking about, as we go further down the list, we're going to get more resistant to wanting to do active scanning, right? Scan away in IT. Most IT environments are scan whenever you want. IT, OT, DMZ, scan whenever you want. I think pretty much in most environments that I've seen. Right? And then, yeah, as you move down, right, it's like, oh, we might allow active scanning within a certain window. So as you go through level 3, level 2, because again, remember, the vast majority of those assets, those systems, they're all Windows machines. They should be able to handle an Nmap scan or maybe a Nessus vulnerability scan. If I still see that a lot in OT environments. So as you go further down, that's where we're going to be less receptive to active scanning. And that usually is where we start having conversations about worrying about a PLC getting knocked over or bricked based off of an active scan. Again, much more happening in those older environments. So which of the following levels of the Purdue model is typically considered not suitable for active scanning? If it was any of those, it would be level 1. Just remember, it just depends on your organization. Question 8. Which of the following levels of the Purdue model is typically not going to receive immediate updates on software and firmware? It's the same concept, right? The idea is that those lower levels, we're not going to be rushing to patch or update it. And more than likely, we probably don't need to because they're so deep within the network that it takes a lot of work for an attacker to get there. And ideally, again, in the perfect world, we would have network security monitoring in place to be able to catch an attacker in the environment before they get to those lower levels, like where the PLC sit. So, which the following levels of the Purdue model is typically not going to receive immediate updates. That's going to be level 1. And I always think of PLCs in particular, or DCS, right? Question 9, which of the following would not be considered an indicator of compromise? Remember, indicators of compromise are pieces of evidence or clues that we can use to determine is an attacker in the environment or not. Right? So when we have a known IP address of a compromised machine where we know an attacker is coming from, or we have the file hash of a file that is known to contain a tool used by an attacker. Right. Or the domain name, right? We know an attacker has compromised a host at ICSsecurity.org. I don't know if that's probably a real domain, but I'm just using that as an example because they like to register things that look real and even maybe imply security, even though it could be registered by an attacker. So domain names can also be indicators of compromise. Serial numbers are particular to individual assets, so it's not sure. I might know that that asset is compromised and that's its serial number, but I can't use that serial number to find the attacker on any other devices. That's what we're trying to use those IOCs for. Remember, if I have one IP address that I know is bad and the attacker is coming from, I can look across the entire environment and say, hey, are there any other assets talking with this IP address or not? And if they are, it's like, oh, they're compromised too. That's the idea of an indicator of compromise. So C, serial number would not be an IOC. All right, and finally for this unit, which of the following is an organization that shares intel about cyber threats associated with a particular sector? That's where we talked about the ISACs. And that there's an ISAC for all the different, in the US at least, for all the different critical the different sectors, and looking at pretty much any type of industry that we can come up with in the OT world has an ISAC associated with it. And there's even just the general like OT ISAC, which is supported through like Dragos. There's multi-state ISAC, which is kind of more at the government level, trying to support different entities and critical and infrastructure and just OT in general, and the list goes on, right? There's the automotive ISAC. I think there's actually someone was mentioning there's an AI ISAC now. So not familiar with that one, but that's what somebody was mentioning. So yeah, so ISAC. So those information sharing groups, right? The idea is you join, you share information like indicators of compromise from attacks you've experienced, and then the others within the ISAC also do the same. So you're learning from each other, even though there typically, at least from my experience, typically only be a few parties that actually share information, and most people or groups that are there that they're just kind of lurkers. So, but, all right. So in Unit 6, this is talking about using open source intelligence to find out information about our OT environments. In particularly, do we have any assets exposed directly to the internet that an attacker could take control over and use that as a foothold on the OT network? So question 1, which of the following would refer to intelligence gathers? Gathered, how about gathered from confidential informants and spies? This is a little bit out of the wheelhouse, but we did talk about it in the class, and that was the human intelligence or humans, A. So I do, for me, I think even cybersecurity, especially in the OT world, it always comes back to the spy game. So I did kind of want to put that in there. So A for question 1. Question 2, which records can help provide further information associated with a specific domain name and its registration? That was WHOIS. And we use the DNSlytics site to find that information during the course. That's the one website that I like to use, but everybody has their preference. But yeah, WHOIS. Question number 3, which of the following sites can be used to obtain a list of hosts associated with a domain name? And that was DNS Dumpster, right? DNS Dumpster is a great tool where you can go put in a domain name, and then it'll come up with, at least by default, it'll show you, right, 100 of the records. And then you can, if you need to go over that, Tim Tomes has ReconNG, which you can use as an open source tool. It'll go up to 500 records. And then if you need more than that, then you have to pay. But DNS Dumpster, the web interface, I think that works for a lot of the engagements I work on. I have had to go to ReconNG. Like my day job at Floor, we have more than 100 internet-facing hosts. So the web interface doesn't just do it all for us. But DNS Dumpster, yeah, B. So question number 4, which of the following sites could be used to gain sensitive information posted about a target organization, such as what ICS vendors they use? And this is the one where we talked about a couple of examples in the course, but it's LinkedIn. So a lot of times LinkedIn doesn't get thought of from an especially open source intelligence gathering platform, but you can go to LinkedIn and you can just say, put in a target company. You can find the employees in those targeted companies, and then you can look based off of position, maybe look for like ICS OT engineer. Sometimes you'll see like ICS OT cybersecurity engineer. And then if you look at their profile, they might talk about some of their current projects or tools that they're using. So if you want to learn, what OT network security monitoring platform that a target environment has. If you look up that ICS OT cybersecurity engineer, and they're talking about having, just say, the Dragos platform on their profile, then chances are we know they're using the Dragos platform, right? Or insert whichever platform, right, that they have listed in their profile. So yeah, LinkedIn can give a lot of sensitive information away, and people just don't realize it. I get people, right, want to talk about what they do, and kind of, hey, this is who I am, what I do. Maybe I'm looking for another job, right? They want to put all that information out there. I get that, but we also have to be conservative and think, what can an attacker do with this if they found it? Oop. I was trying to scroll, not minimize the screen. Sorry. All right, let's jump back down here. Question 5. Which of the following is not considered an ICS OT specific protocol that is discovered by Shodan? So now that I think about this, it's not the greatest worded question. Because it makes me think of one of the earlier questions we were talking about, ICS OT protocols. I should be a little bit more specific. I think ICS OT specific versions that run over TCP/IP, right? Because Shodan only scans the internet. The only thing we're going to see on the internet is anything talking TCP/IP, right? So traditional ICS OT protocols that don't run on IP, they're not going to show up, right? So I should adjust this question. But we do have versions of Modbus, S7, BACnet that run over IP. So we would see these through Shodan. HTTPS, man, that's a generic protocol we use for websites. So we talk about the answer here, HTTPS, which is that protocol we see. It's ubiquitous to IT and OT. It just means you have a web server sitting there running. And we could have a web server, like on an HMI or a data historian potentially, or any asset in any environment. These days, pretty much can have a web service and a web app running there. So, and we have to make sure we take those into consideration from a security perspective. So for this question, yeah, the HTTPS is not a traditional ICS or OT protocol that runs over TCP/IP these days, like the others. So question 6, which of the following Shodan searches should be used to find potential devices exposed to the internet via Modbus? So the question or the answer would be port :502. So A. Just remember, if you run that in Shodan, it pulls up, like we saw in the unit, it pulls up every system connected to the internet that has port 502 open, whether it's Modbus or not. So there are a lot of assets out there, more than not, that it's not Modbus on that port. The port's just open for something else. So you have to look deeper to see, is this really Modbus or not? That's why we had other searches to help us find, like what really, is running Modbus. So, but yeah, port 502, right? TCP 502 is the port associated by default with Modbus. That's what we're really asking there. All right, question 7. Which of the following Shodan searches could be used to search for findings across an entire subnet range? It's going to be the very last one there. So you just type in net : the range you're looking for, and then it'll pull up any assets within that network range that it knows about. So yeah, D for question 7. Question number 8, which of the following ICS specific protocols is associated with building automation systems? I think we're mentioning this earlier. That's the BACnet, right? The BA building automation. So it's kind of a giveaway if you can remember what the acronym stands for. So D, BACnet. Question 9, which of the following devices is designed to purposely be hacked? And that's a honeypot. So it's a system that we put on the network to watch or let attackers come after it. Usually if we put it on the internet, we're doing that because we want it to be attacking. We want to watch what attackers are doing to learn about how attackers are attacking. If we have it on the inside of the network, that's more where it's more of an incident detection tool, and that if it gets hit by something we don't know about, then we know there's an attacker almost 100% on the network, or something is going on that we don't know about and that we need to investigate. That's where they talk about those high fidelity alerts that we get from a honeypot, right? If it gets hit on the internal network, then you need to respond immediately because almost 100% something bad is happening. All right, in question 10, which of the following Shodan features could be used to find HMIs that are exposed to the internet? So that was the one where we looked at the images search, right? And the number of HMIs being exposed to the internet is dropping dramatically, which is a good thing from a security perspective. Kind of sad when, I used to have a lot of fun finding all of these connected to the internet. but yeah, you can use that images search to go through and literally look at the pictures that Shodan, or the screenshots Shodan takes of all the assets that it finds, and mostly webcams, right? But every once in a while you'll find those HMIs. Yeah, that's without spending the $10,000 a month or whatever it is for the Buku major account for Shodan. That's the way to do it. So all right. So let's talk about Unit 7, Incident Detection. So question 1, when it comes to, let's see, according to the Pyramid of Pain, which of the following indicators of compromise is or are the easiest to use to find malicious activity? So I looked at the hash value is going to be the most specific to a file, right? So if we have that, we know absolutely without a shadow of a doubt, if that's a known malicious file, it's always going to be malicious no matter where in the world we see it. The others are great indicators to track, right? IP addresses. But those IP addresses, they're not always going to be known to be bad, right? Once we let somebody know, hey, you've been compromised, right? An attacker's using your system to attack other people, they usually get that fixed and the IP address, stops being malicious. Same thing with domain names. Maybe I mentioned it was ICSsecurity.org earlier, right? It probably does exist. What if an attacker did compromise it? Again, the owners of that domain, they're notified. They clean up the compromise. Again, I'm not saying they've been compromised as an example, and then they go back to not being malicious anymore. So again, it's not always static, right? And then the tactics, techniques, and procedures we talk about in MITRE, right? Those are very high level. We're just saying an attacker can get a foothold in your environment and they can exploit code to move in the environment, but it's all very high level. There's really not specific signatures that we can look for necessarily, right? And that's very advanced CTI teams that are gathering and being able to put those pieces together. So the easiest to use is going to be the hash value. I guess that's true. I was just thinking, well, when we talk about quote unquote easiest to use, maybe the easiest is actually like an IP address, but we'll go with hash value. Question 2, which of the following is a framework provided to help defenders understand what attackers do once they have gained a foothold in the environment? Or that's MITRE ATT&CK. So C. And we talk more about that also in Unit 10 when we talk about penetration testing and building that pen test model on MITRE ATT&CK for ICS. Right? So C, but that's also where those tactics, techniques, and procedures come from that we were just talking about in question 1. Question 3, which of the following would not be considered network forms of incident detection? And this kind of threw a lot of acronyms in here. I guess I was trying to be tricky. So what these are, right? We had network-based intrusion prevention systems. So those are network-based appliance. So that would be a network form. Same thing with network-based intrusion detection systems, right? Once prevention is active, detection is passive, right? But we want to see detection in OT environments, which I guess we'll talk about on the next question. A network firewall is going to, that would be network-based. And then EDR, right, endpoint detection and response, that's installed locally on your systems like Windows host. So that would not be a network-based form of incident detection. So EDR, that's host-based. So question 3, the answer is C, endpoint detection and response. And then question number 4, which of the following types of intrusion detection platforms can be used to alert on known malicious traffic at the network level, but it takes no further action? That was what we were just talking about with NIDS. Remember, it's network, the N is for network, so it's network-based, and that it's only doing detection, the D. It's not taking any further action. It's not trying to be reactive like NIPS. So NIPS, again, there's an N, so it's network-based. The P is for network prevention. So that way, if it detects an attack, then it can take action like send a update to a firewall to update an ACL to block that traffic, or it can send reset packets to the source of that traffic to say, hey, I'm not here, don't talk to me, to essentially shut it down. So again, in OT environments, we want to use detection, not prevention. Because with prevention, you could potentially block, needed required traffic, and then that could introduce some type of availability issue and potentially a safety issue. But yeah, so question 4 is A. That's the one we want to use in OT environments. So, okay. So question 5, which of the following types of host-based intrusion detection platforms can be used to alert on known malicious traffic and take steps to block activity? And that's what we were just talking about. If it's host-based, that's the H, right? So we know we're down to C or D. And then if it's taking action to block, remember that's the P, the prevention. So the host-based intrusion prevention system, or D, HIPS. All right. Question 6, which of the following network devices broadcast a received packet out all available ports? Or that's going to be an old school hub, right? Have that packet come in, and we're going to send it out all of the ports, which means if you're sending on one of those ports with a sniffer like Wireshark, you can read or see all the network traffic. So there's definitely a security concern there. Question 7, which of the following can be used to centrally store security events while performing event correlation to identify suspicious and malicious activity requiring human investigation? Oof. It's a SIM. And just like in the IT world, the OT world works exactly the same. We want to bring in event data from all of the sources that we can to bring it into one place to have it centrally stored, so that way we can do what they call correlation. So the idea is that we're not looking at just events from one asset. We're looking at events, again, ideally from all assets, firewalls and hosts and PLCs and HMIs and data historians, our Active Directory domain controllers in OT. And we're looking across all of those events for the big picture that we can use to determine if an attack is taking place or not. If we're only looking at one asset's event logs, we might not know if there's an attack happening or not. We could, but if we're not looking at the big picture, we're more than likely missing something. And that's the benefit of having SIM. So D, remember security event and incident management, or and then you see variations of SIM and SIM and SEM, but I always go SEIM. Question 8, which of the following is not true related to logging and collection of security event data? So which of the following is not true related to logging and collection of security event data? So security event data should be forwarded to a central location for archiving. Yeah, that's what we were just talking about. Well, archiving is just storing, but at a bare minimum, yeah, we definitely want to at least have that on record in case we need it for an investigation down the road. Human analysts are capable of manually analyzing large amounts of security event data. I think we can say probably not. Right? The idea is we're only human. We can only look at so much information. In my day job, we generate like 10 terabytes of event data a day. That's just from our host. That's a lot. And then there's another terabyte or two on network event data. No human being in the world could review that information, right? And be able to determine if there's an attack. So question 8 is B. We just can't do it all or that fast. Question 9, which of the following is an open source honeypot platform that can simulate an ICS OT asset? And the big one there is Teapot. Yeah, B. There's a couple out there. Compot's another one, but Teapot I think is the one I'm more familiar with. I had Sanders, and I think Chris Sanders wrote the book on honeypots that we were talking about. So definitely check it out if you want to learn more about those. But yeah, the answer for question 9 is B, Teapot. And then question 10, proactively searching for signs of malicious activity on the network is referred to as which of the following? This is where we talk about the key is proactively searching. So when we talk about intrusion detection or even intrusion prevention, those are usually more kind of default searching, if that makes sense, right? We install tools and it alerts us if it finds something. When we're being proactive, it means we're jumping in the system and we're more than likely using tools to look to see, is there a sign of an attacker in the environment. This is where we talk about assuming breach. I always assume there's someone in the network. I just have to find them. They're there. I know it. I just have to find it. Now, they might not be there, especially in OT environments, right? It's less common. And in IT, I always assume there's somebody there doing something that they shouldn't be, whether it's an attacker or it's an employee just doing something stupid. Somebody's in the environment doing something that they shouldn't. And so that's where we can use threat hunting as a way, as a process, a repeatable process to go through and look for signs of somebody in the environment doing something that they shouldn't, whether, again, it's an attacker or maybe an employee doing something that they shouldn't. So C, threat hunting, question 10. All right. So let's start to look at Unit 8 for incident response. So Unit A, let's talk about question 1. Without additional context, which of the following is neither good or bad, nor bad? This already talked about. An event means we have a recorded something that happened, but we don't know if it's good or bad by default, right? If we see Mike logged into this engineering workstation, right? Mike's account logged into this engineering workstation, we don't know if it was actually Mike or an attacker, right? So without additional context, an event, again, it's neutral. We don't know if it's good or bad. We need the additional context. So the answer to question 1 is A, an event. Now, question 2, a security incident which includes unauthorized access to sensitive data is classified as a what? This is where we talked about the difference between an incident and a breach. Is in a breach, this is where an attacker has access to sensitive, or say classified information that's not supposed to be exposed. Because once they have access, they could take that data. And maybe you didn't even see a file being copied, but you don't know if they took a screenshot or not. So anytime an attacker has unauthorized access to special sensitive data, then that's considered a breach. So D, as in dog. Question 3. A single maintenance laptop is determined to be infected with malware and spreads to a Windows-based data historian and engineering workstation. Which risk classification should be assigned to this incident? I think this is going to depend on the organization or the environment. But when we look at this from a, how serious is this perspective? So low would be if we had one host infected. In this case, there's multiple hosts infected. And it's not just the IT network. This is on the OT network. So that already bumps it up, right? And now we would also ask other questions that are specific to the OT environment that we don't see in IT, like is operations impacted? Is physical and environmental safety impacted? And that's why I think the idea here is that I highlighted the 3 assets that are infected or compromised if we want. It's a maintenance laptop, an engineering workstation, and a data historian. I don't need those 3 things for the availability of the plant. I don't need them to ensure physical and environmental safety. So we could, again, and it depends on the environment. So you could say low, because again, it's not impacting operations. But since it's more than one asset, I probably would still go with medium, just because, again, it has spread, and we want to make sure you have some elevated concern and make sure it doesn't spread to anything else, right? So I would say in this case, medium. It's not high or critical because, again, there's no assets that have been compromised that are going to impact operations or physical or environmental safety. So again, I would say B. Question 4. if a cybersecurity incident presents risk to either physical or environmental safety, which classification should be assigned to this incident. So this basically kind of just tails in off of what we were just talking about. All right, physical safety or environmental safety, right? The idea that somebody could get hurt or killed, or there would be damage done to the environment from the facility, right? It's automatically a critical, right? We take it the most seriously. That's where I know in my day job at Floor, right? If anybody on a job site ever suspects that there's an issue that can cause a physical issue, right? Somebody could get hurt, somebody could die, that they can issue a stop for that entire site, right? And shut everything down to ensure the physical safety of our personnel. Right? So again, if physical security or environmental safety is ever a question, it's critical or at risk. It's impacted. It's critical. All right, question number 5, which of the following phases of the incident response process includes providing training to the incident response team members? And there are those 6 phases, and we like to look at the SANS incident response process. But the very first phase, preparation, right? That's where we're doing all the work ahead of time to make sure everybody's ready for when we detect the incident that's going to occur. So preparation, that's where we do all of our training and getting ready. So answer is A, preparation. All right, question 6, which of the following phases of the incident response process includes resetting any passwords and tokens for employees? So that's almost always, especially in the IT, but also in OT. If we detect attackers in the environment, they have access to systems, especially Windows, that one of the first things we're going to do is ask everybody to reset their password. So ideally, it could lock out the attacker from that point. And so usually that a lot of people will put that in, I should say, C, eradication. Now there's a little bit more to it, because like true eradication is you will have to guarantee that the attacker doesn't come back. And so that would require you doing things like disconnecting from the internet if you're in IT, or disconnecting from IT if you're an OT. So then when you eradicate, right, you have everybody change all the passwords, then if the attacker is remote and you were disconnected, right, the attacker is not in your environment at that moment when you reset your password, right? That's true eradication, but you have to disconnect completely as long as the attacker is remote, and they're going to be most times. All right, question number 7, which of the following phases includes members of the incident response team working to understand the organization's strengths during an incident, as well as opportunities for improvement? That was the very last phase. Remember, lessons learned, or D, where we come back after an incident to determine, hey, what did we do well? What were our strengths? And then, hey, where could we improve? So that way we make ourselves better for next time, because there's going to be a next time. So lessons learned, B. Question number 8, during an incident, which of the following is necessary for communications? So we talk about communications has to be tightly controlled during an incident. And there's a couple things going on in here that we want to make sure that we don't broadcast to the entire employee, hey, there's an incident going on. Because sometimes even that incident might not even turn out to be anything. I've got called on many incidents where it was then turn out to be anything. There's one example where it got called in to do incident response, and it turned out to be like they thought a nation state attacker was in the environment, and it was spyware. And then I've been in the other side where it was a nation state. So, but yeah, in this case, right, we don't want to just announce to everybody or the world at large, like the news and the general public, that an incident's occurring unless we're legally mandated to do that. And we want to control communications. Now, for our partner or for our responders, This is where we want to use out-of-band communication. We're going to assume that if an attacker's in the environment, they have control over things like email, or they have at least access to email so they can read what's going on. They have access to our internal messaging systems, like maybe like Teams. Maybe they have access to even maybe the web conferencing platform that we normally use, like we use Teams, or what if it's WebEx or whatever. You have to assume that the attackers have access to your normally used tool set. So use out-of-band communication, like maybe something like Signal that you can set up and you only use it for incident response. So in this case, C, use out-of-band communication for responders, but also remember, tightly control who knows about an incident. Question 9, which of the following can be used as a tool for reinforcing the actions to be taken by the incident response team members during an incident? And then this is where we get into the idea of, it's going to be either incident playbook, right, or an incident runbook. Idea is playbooks are much higher level, runbook are step-by-step instructions. So when we talk about which of the following can be used as a tool for reinforcing the actions to be taken, I think what I was asking for in this case was more of the step-by-step instructions. I think I should have been a little bit more clear, but we would say runbook. You would be okay if you said playbook as well. So, but D. And then question 10, which of the following tools can be used to help people learn and understand incident response better? That's where you can see I thought I was having a little fun with this, but backdoors and breaches is that one card game that, and there's the ICS version that came out that Black Hills Security did, which is a really great tool for learning incident response and doing tabletops on the fly. Threat Gen by Clint Bondugan, I think is how we say his last name. I always screw it up. Is absolutely amazing, though. I will put in a plug for that, where it's all AI based. He did a phenomenal job, and it creates scenarios on the fly, and you can put any type of ICS, OT, or IT environment. He's also done like sci-fi, like Stargate and Star Wars, and so check that out. Threat Gen. So, anyways, but if you want to do the card game, Backdoors and Breaches is an awesome tool from Black Hills Security. Okay. So we're starting to wind down. So Unit 9, risk assessments, governance, and compliance. So probably everybody's least favorite section before we get to everybody's favorite section of pen testing. But question 1, at which phase of the ISA 62443 lifecycle is a target level assigned to a zone's security level? So, and you can see we have this assess where we look at, doing at least an initial risk assessment, understanding the environment and what level of risk is associated. Design and implement, where we're going to design like what security controls that we're going to deploy, right? And we use those to improve security over time, and then we can maintain that. But we always really want to be improving, right? We never want to stay stagnant. But in that assess phase, right, that's where we're going to determine initially as part of our risk assessment process is for that environment, what is the organization's or the asset owner's risk tolerance, and what do they want to protect against? Are they worried about protecting against nation states, right? That takes a lot more than if I'm just worried about protecting against script kiddies with no skill and really no tool sets. Or what about if I want to protect against the most common threat in OT today, which is very real, is ransomware. So whether it's my day job or my side consulting job, that's the main focus, is protecting our OT environments against ransomware. I'm not going to spend all the extra resources and money for nation states. In fact, most people don't have those resources. But we do want to protect against the most common realistic threat today, which is ransomware. But that happens during the assess phase, A. Question number 2, which of the following is a logical grouping of systems with a shared mission? That's where we were talking about earlier. That's where we group assets together into zones. And it's usually the assets that talk the most together, we'll put them in a zone. That's kind of a general rule you can use as well. Question number 3, which of the following security levels would be assigned when protection against nation-state adversaries is required? So if we do work for an environment, they're saying we're going to spend the money and have the team members and all the tools and all the resources to protect against nation states. The highest level, the highest security level you could have is 4, right? That means we're protected as much as we can be against nation states. SL5 does not exist. So it's one of those wrong answers. So C, SL4. So question 4, which of the following zones should be assigned the highest possible security level? Out of all of these, it's always going to be the SIS, the Safety Instrumented System. Remember, that's the controls we use to shut down the plant if there's ever a fault condition that could result in some type of physical or environmental or availability issue. But if it ever comes down to someone getting hurt or killed or the environment being harmed, it's automatically a critical issue. It has the highest security possible, or the highest possible security level. That's the SIS A. We're going to say the SIS is a zone. So, question 5, at which phase of the ISA 62443 life cycle is an achieved security level assigned to a zone? So remember, in the assess phase, we say we want the security level, let's say, to be 3. We want to be able to protect against all the common threats and then some. Or let's say 2. Let's be more realistic. We want, and let's say it's for a manufacturing plant, and we want all of the zones, or the entire plant, to be protected against ransomware. They're not worried about nation-state attackers, so they're not worried about a 4. They're not worried about even slightly more sophisticated group actors. So they're not worried about SL3. So we're going to say we're going to be at security level 2. When I come back, I say, well, then how do we determine, right, where the security level is today? What have we achieved? Depending on how you look at it too, this is a whole other story. But it also can be in the assess phase, right? Sometimes you also talk about it in design and implement, and sometimes in improve, not necessarily maintain. That's a good question. I'm trying to remember from 62443. I did get all the tests, and this which one we would go through. Officially, where we would sign the achieve security level. I'm thinking now it's probably design and implement. Well, design and implement is actually where we apply the security controls. So it's either going to be at the tail end of B or C. I guess I'll have to look that one up. I guess I didn't come prepared. So B or C, final answer. But we'll have to look that one up. So, question number 6, which of the following is not one of the 4 T's of addressing risk? So when you look at it's B, it's just a wrong answer, because we can determine if we tolerate the risk. So we're just going to let it be, which hopefully we never do, unless it's very minimal, right? And it just really doesn't represent really any risk. Like something silly like, oh, there's rust on that chain link fence, so there's risk that somebody, I don't know, the fence might break down in 30 years. That it's just not even on the radar. Right? It's like, okay, we're going to accept that risk, right? Who even put that in a report? I've seen silly things like that. Transfer means we take that risk and we transfer it to either an outside party like cybersecurity insurance, or maybe like a partner. They're responsible, right? If there's a cybersecurity incident in the plant, up until commissioning, that company is responsible for it, right? That's what happens in my day job often. Terminate means we eliminate or we get rid of the risk, which ultimately, sure, that's what we always want to do. But do we, like in the case of the silly rust on the chain link fence, right? Do we really need to address that? No. So why bother? Or there are some risks that are just out of our reach. They're just too expensive to address, right? We just don't have a choice, right? And everything in between. So yeah, so B is an incorrect is the answer, right? It's not one of those ways to address risk. All right, question number 7. Which of the following is not one of the 5 Ds of cybersecurity defense? So we can deter attackers, we can deflect attackers, and we can delay attackers. But do we want to direct them? So if I remember, this is another one. I'm like, I'm having to go back through 62443. I don't really have a lot of conversations around the 5 Ds of cybersecurity defense, but I believe yes, this is B, direct. Question number 8, which of the following establishes the need for cybersecurity within an organization and authorizes a cybersecurity program? Remember, cybersecurity within an organization starts with the policies. If you do not have a policy, you do not have cybersecurity, right? You have to have that policy authorized by the highest authority in the organization that says all of our employees and our partners, right, and contractors, right, you're going to do these things and you're not going to do these other things, right? We have to tell people what they can and cannot do and have it come from the highest law in the land, right, for that organization, like the CEO or maybe like a CIO or CISO. So that way, if they violate the policy, then we're going to enforce it. But you have to have the policy and you have to also enforce it, right, before you can have actual cybersecurity in an organization. So A. Question 9, which of the following governs cybersecurity regulations for entities responsible for electricity generation and transmission in the United States, power generation and transmission in the US, Canada, and is all run through NERC, B. And then question 10, which of the following ISA 62443 foundational requirements addresses secure network architecture? And so I think there's 7 foundational requirements, if I remember right. This is where he's against another one. I can see the slide in my mind. I think I have it right. But the idea is we look at restricted data flow. So think of, in 62443, we have the zones. Remember our network segments where we've logically grouped those assets together with the shared mission, as we refer to it, right? Those assets that talk the most usually to each other, right? They have that shared mission, right? That in the same process. And then we have multiple zones in an OT environment, right? You have one zone for, like the SIS and even just that, right? And then maybe everything else is just in one zone, let's just say. So we have 2 zones. But when you have multiple zones, which we always will, you want to make sure we restrict the flow of data between them, right? We'll use things like access control lists to prevent assets in one zone from talking with assets in another if they don't need to communicate. Because if we allow communication between those assets and they don't need to communicate, then if an attacker gets on one of those assets, they can use those, right? They can reach out to those other assets, see if there's vulnerabilities, compromise those other assets and use them, right, to gain more and more access and eventually take control over the environment. So restricted data flow, D for question 10. All right, I have to go back and brush up on 62443. All right, so penetration testing for ICS OT. So question 1, which of the following is absolutely required before any penetration testing may be performed against a system? This is the one where at the very least you have to have authorization. In this case, it would come from the asset owner or representative. So maybe you're working with the CISO for that organization, and they would have the ability to authorize a pen test. You would also establish things like rules of engagement to understand like the scope. What are you pen testing? Maybe it's just IT, or maybe from IT and you're assuming a breach of IT. So you also want to see, can you gain access to a host in the DMZ, the IT/OT DMZ from IT? But maybe that's as far as it goes. And that's the most common pen test scenario that you see. right? Can you get into the IT, OT, DMZ? Typically won't see somebody, going into a production environment at lower levels of the Purdue model or the actual OT network itself. In lab environments, yes, not into a production environment. So question 2, which of the following tools can be used to craft a payload and launch an exploit against a potentially vulnerable asset? That's going to be Metasploit. And Metasploit does have some exploits for ICS OT assets. Not as much, of course, as it does for IT. That's its main focus, but some ICS OT capabilities have been added to it over the years. I think a lot of damage can be done in the OT world, not even using exploits. That's like with Pipedream, where we mentioned, right, it exploits just how the basic default functionality of OT assets. Remember, living off the land. So you don't even need a tool like Metasploit necessarily to do significant damage in OT environments. So which stage of the ICS kill chain is associated with an attacker being on the ICS network? So I pulled up the slides so we can go back and see. In the SANS ICS kill chain, I should put SANS in the question. You start with the IT, right? The attacker getting into the IT network, that's stage 1. And then as they get into the ICS or the OT environment, that's stage 2. So the answer for this question would be stage 2. Let's put 0 in there because I thought I was being cool. So the answer is C, stage 2. So question number 4, which type of penetration test involves the penetration tester receiving no information about a target environment? My absolute favorite, and I think most pen testers, is the black box, where you're not told anything. That can be a little dangerous though. So you want the asset owner in this case, or the team you're working with, right, for that OT environment to provide you some basic information. That's part of the scope, right? Understanding, hey, what IP ranges are going to be within scope at a bare minimum, right? You don't want to be attacking things that you shouldn't be. Like maybe they don't want you to potentially try to knock over the SIS, right? So let's not touch the fail-safe backup. So let's get some information from the environment. So yes, so the black box is where you get no information, but it's not even a good idea in IT. Get at least some basic pieces of information. Question number 5, which of the following Nmap commands would effectively enumerate an ICS asset running Modbus? So remember, Modbus runs on port 502, so that's one of the things we're going to start looking for. So when you look at the structure, so where you can see Nmap and then the IP address of what we're targeting, and then the next thing we specify is, of course, the port. So we see port 502 is for Modbus, 102 is for S7, the Siemens protocol. And then we just have to remember which of the Nmap parsers, or the scripts, I should say, sorry, is correct. And it's actually the last one. So the answer for this one is D. So Nmap IP address -P502 for the Modbus default port dash dash, that's a dash dash script Modbus dash discover. So question 6, which of the following the Modbus function codes is for the command recoil? This is kind of a trick question. I mean, I don't think we actually covered this in Unit 10. We actually covered it all the way back like in Unit 3. Unit 2. Yeah, I think Unit 2 or 3. But the idea is, the answer is A. The function code of 1 is recoil. Remember, you have coils and registers in Modbus where we store information. So you can go ahead and use the Modbus function code of 1 is for recoil. All right, question 7. Which of the following tactics is used when an attacker sends large amounts of junk data to an application or service to see how the target responds? That is called fuzzing. So We're only going to be we're not doing that in any production environments. But if you have either a home lab, you have a test lab, if you have specific assets that you're trying to test against, that you also have in production, you can use different fuzzing tools to just throw complete garbage. The idea is that some to determine different types of vulnerabilities, right? Does that application or that asset hang or crash when it gets all this generic junk thrown at it? If it hangs or crashes somewhere along the way, there's a vulnerability in some way, shape, or form there. Usually some type of, how do we handle, like in memory, right? How do we handle all this crap that we're, having thrown at us, right? But if it hangs or freezes or crashes, there's a vulnerability there that could potentially be exploited. So that is fuzzing. Question 8, which of the following tactics is used when attempting to determine a login password for a target asset over the network using a precompiled file of hundreds of possible passwords? Like, oof, that was a mouthful. But the idea is that's what we call C, or a word list attack. Right? The idea is we have a text file, or if you want, a word list, right, filled with like 100, say, different, or in this case, I guess, hundreds of different passwords. Go say, take the most common 500 used passwords known to humankind, put it in this word list, which is just again a text file, and then we can say, hey, try to log into this PLC using these 500 passwords, and see if we get lucky with one. That's a word list attack. So C. Question 9, which of the following web application vulnerabilities allows an attacker to access information outside of the web app's root directory? Choose the most appropriate answer. We didn't cover this in the unit, so I think I need to go update some of these questions. So I feel bad. I think I wrote these questions before I actually finished the unit, honestly. So this is not fair if you don't come from a IT, typically pen test background. But which the following web app vulnerabilities allows an attacker to access information outside of the web app's root directory? That's called, you might guess by the name, but directory traversal. So you can hit a web server and maybe it actually lets you jump directories to where you could actually go to things like pulling up a command prompt on a Windows machine through a web app. It's a lot of fun when you're able to do that and run commands through a web application, right? That's usually kind of, I think for me when I'm doing web app pen testing, that's kind of like the holy grail for me. That's where you have a lot of fun. All right, and then question 10, which of the following ICS assets is most likely to be running a web service, which could be used to gain access to the host? And we talked a little bit about this definitely throughout the course, but that's the HMI. Remember, a lot of HMIs today, actually, that page that you're seeing, right, that graphical image, the picture, right, of the process and where you can click and make changes, that HMI is now on a lot of assets. It's just a web page. And so that web page, right, runs as it's a web application running on a web server sitting on the HMI. And so that it's going to have potentially vulnerabilities. More than likely, it is going to be vulnerable. Every web app and the web server that it runs on, right, they all have vulnerabilities. So we have to pay particular attention to those web services and those web apps running the environment because nobody ever pays attention to them, honestly. And so it's one of those, my number one target in OT is always going to be a data historian, but right after that is the HMI. Going to go right after those web apps because no one is looking at them. And if they're patching like all the Windows machines, they're not patching that Windows-based HMI that's probably there in the environment. So that brings us officially now to the end of the course stuff. So again, I really appreciate everybody for taking the time. Remember, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can reach out to me at mikeholcomb.com. But again, thank you. If you made it to the very end of this, send me a note. Just I don't know if anybody ever makes it to the actual end. But if you really do, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to go through all this material because it's a lot. So and it says a lot and about how passionate and how much you want to learn ICS OT. So thanks again. I'll see you out there on LinkedIn or YouTube, and take care.